Hello everyone, and here is this week's lecture in which we're going to continue from where we left off, talking about the gaze and more importantly the power that is part of that process. And we're going to look at a specific, I won't even call it a case study because it's too big and too significant in our story, but it's sort of a case study with regard to the relationship between art and power in terms of the power of the church. And we'll talk about, we'll be exploring why that is so important that we highlight that specifically. Before we do so, though, it is important to emphasize, I've done this before, I'm going to emphasize it again, that when we're in the whole point of this course, the whole point of the examples that Gordon and I present and then that we discuss, both in terms of the themes and the specific objects, is not just to enshrine specifically obvious objects, the best examples or something like that. Rather, what we're trying to do is expose some of the architecture behind our society, some of the structural elements, the skeleton behind our society, so we can understand it better, so we know how we got to where we are here at Sheridan College, in Oakville, in Ontario, in Canada, in North America in the 21st century, and what that means to us, and what kinds of obligations we have both to the society around us and the world that we're constructing together. So I just put it in terms, I'm going to steal some words from Lisa Lowe. She has a fantastic book called The Intimacies of Four Continents. I was just reaching for it so I can have it in my hand as I'm referencing it. And there's a whole lot going on in that book, and I'll probably be referring to it again as we move forward, but I found this very interesting quote from her. The reason to study history, these are her words, it's not about a historical reconstruction that explains or justifies our present. So we're not looking to do a history because we want to explain or justify our present, but a critical project that would both expose the constructedness of the past and release the present from the dictates of that former construction. So one of the reasons, although I am interested in explaining and exploring our present, so I don't want to just dismiss out of hand that first part of that comment from Lisa Lowe here, but I really do want to emphasize that second part that she's emphasizing, a critical project that exposes the constructedness of the past, and we talked about that already, and releases the present from the dictates of that former construction. That's not just about saying, well, I'm not going to be influenced by history and do whatever I like and do something new, but it's recognizing how we already are, unconsciously and implicitly affected by the society around us, and how we can, by acknowledging that constructedness, try to, as she says, release ourselves from the dictates of that construction. So as we keep moving forward, this has applied already, and as we move forward into the material today, keep that in mind. It's not just a question of producing objects that we think are brilliant and therefore you just have to know them. It's about presenting the objects, exploring what they represent, and then beginning to see how we can escape from some of the traps that have been laid for us by history. Not intentionally all the time, but sometimes, yes. So let's move forward. So this is what we talked about last week and even a little bit the week before, this relationship between the subject and the object, and I introduced this idea last week of the gaze, and we'll be returning to that. The method, the process by which the subject looks at the object, and there's so much more going on there than just a simple act of viewing an object, that the gaze, this concept of the gaze, represents a whole power structure, or a power process, rather, as I kind of described it, an electrical current that flows from the subject to the object and then back again. So it is all about power. It's not all exclusively about power, but power is perhaps, at least the way I've been presenting it, the most important thing that we need to take out of that relationship. So I introduced images, and I talked about this image, for example, and the way the artist and the people who were supporting the artist and the people who were in charge of the church where this work is produced, where this Masaccio is hanging, even still, not hanging, it's on the wall, so like that is present there, it's about telling a story, it's about conveying a message, and it is very much about power. Now, what we have done as we've looked at this question of power so far, last week and a little bit the week before, is look at it at the individual level, as if our interests, our primary interests, as they have been, is how does the individual, that means you by yourself or anyone else by themselves, engage with that work, and how does the work engage with the individual, and how is that? So as you are the subject, kind of individual subject, looking at the individual object, and we talk about the gaze and the electric charge and the power and all of that at that individual level. While we're going to continue talking about the impact that these works of art have on the individual. We're now also going to be looking at the sort of the two extended levels. I don't want to say higher levels because that suggests a hierarchy, and that's definitely not what I'm going for here. Extended levels above that. So the social level, meaning where we begin to interact with other people and where the power structures influence more than just ourselves, and where we're talking about a society as a subject, a group of people who share some kind of common values and a common position. Quite how we define a society, we'll have to explore that as we go. But now, going back to that original idea of the subject looking at the object, think of the subject now as a society. And then, of course, that political level is not just about who's in charge and who's the king or who's the elected official or anything like that. It is that as well, but it's also how does a society, how do a group of people create rules that govern? And these rules can be laws that are the sort of specific laws that can be broken and not broken and adhered to, but there are also the other rules that we operate by, and things like manners and etiquette and belief systems. These are social, but they can also have significant political power, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's move into it as we go. We introduced last week this idea of perspective, the development of linear perspective and single point perspective, and how important that was in the beginning and the sort of early to middle phase of the Renaissance. And don't worry, you haven't missed anything. We haven't introduced the Renaissance yet. We will do that in part at some point, but I want us to jump right into the middle, and then we'll go back to some kind of formal introduction perhaps later. What's important is that we understand how it flows from what came before and what came after. Again, Lisa Lowe's words, so we can release ourselves from the dictates of that construction. So let's just focus specifically on the development of perspective and how it was used and how it was then celebrated by artists. This picture that I showed you last week obviously is a very powerful image, perspective making it so. It's obviously I say obviously, but it is a very beautiful work of art. It's very engaging, and the way it's constructed is of course no accident. The artist Masaccio, having taken time to arrange the figures, to very carefully lay the piece out along the lines of perspective. This, again, to repeat what I said last week, is because this is an age it may be very difficult for us to put our minds back into that environment. They had no TV screens or movie screens. They had no sense of moving pictures. They had no sense of photography. Their experience of the real world was as they saw it through their eyes, meaning such that they were not particularly aware of the process of seeing. Even mirrors were not very common, certainly not at this point in the early 15th century, and the few mirrors that did exist were poor quality and only had by the very, very rich. Most people would not have ever seen an image of the real world other than through their own eyeballs looking at the real world. So seeing the real world, or some version of the real world, presented on a two-dimensional surface like this would have been absolutely mind-blowing. If it was the first time they had seen this, they would be sort of awestruck. They would have an absolutely profoundly emotional experience of this. Far more than you do anytime you turn a screen on, even more than a virtual reality goggle kind of experience. Perhaps maybe that's beginning to get approximately close to the sort of experience that people would have had if this was the first time they'd have encountered an image like this, where there's real space portrayed, a real arrangement of sort of realistic figures in real space. So this image would have been very powerful, and of course, very early on, the church figured out how to use that, and the church is our focus today, because the church realized that and I say realized, they were part and parcel of the whole process. They realized that by constructing images like this that put a viewer's eyeballs right into the picture, so the whole picture is constructed right there. You're looking, basically the average height of someone looking, they'd be looking right here. They look up at this, the picture has this absolutely amazing, overwhelming drawing in. The person is no longer just the person in the church, but they're the person sucked into the whole biblical story. Obviously the church realizes how profoundly important this is. So this Renaissance event, this is happening in very discrete packets, really just in northern Italy, and then soon afterwards, sort of at the same time, in northern Europe, in what today is Holland and a bit of Belgium and a bit of Germany. In the northern Renaissance, this development of pictorial space, this real space in a painting, has a dramatic effect on the way people understand their own existence, understand their relationship to objects in space and the stories behind those objects. Remember, when you look out of your own eyeballs and you see your sheep grazing in a field, okay, you see the sheep grazing in the field, you think about, how many are sick and what are you going to feed them in the wintertime and whatever else you have to think about. Now when you look at a picture like this, you're thinking about ideas that are mind-blowing. Where did the universe come from, and what happens to me after I die? So however much they're really thinking about this, these pictures are providing answers to those big questions. You begin to see why the church specifically is so important. The way that images begin to be developed, the way that the artists who are supported by the church, but beyond that, it's not just a propaganda technique. This is a culture that is entirely church focused, and by church focused I mean Christian story focused. For almost all people in the very specific parts of the world we're talking about, northern Italy and all across Europe, but specific to where these images are coming out of, northern Italy, they're heavily influenced. Their whole lives are defined by the story of the Christian story from the Bible, a bit of the Old Testament and a lot of the New Testament. And so seeing these stories brought to life, like in a way that was just staggering, would have been staggering for their grandparents to conceive of, has a massive impact on what the church can tell us, to tell them about how to live and what rules to live by. And they're using, again, you see very clearly here, they're using that linear perspective to create a real space. So these three figures in the foreground. The history of this painting is quite interesting. Nobody knows. They're obviously very specific people, but who they are is not clear. Here is the story of Christ in the background. And again, who everyone is in this picture could be discussed. There's a lot of art historical discussion about it. What matters to us is that they've put, this artist, Piero della Francesca, has put the real body, the real person of Jesus into the story, into a visual version of the story that the people seeing it could now engage with and interact with. And he is using linear perspective to really create that sense of being sucked in towards. See this door in the background here? It's a sort of backstop of the painting that kind of pulls us into the painting and makes this scene real for us. Even as it develops here a century later, you've got a Tintoretto. This is very late Renaissance into a period called Mannerism after the Renaissance. Let's not get tied up in that. Absolutely amazing painting. This is a 12-meter wide painting. It's absolutely overwhelmingly huge. It's in fact, the figures are basically lifelike. Even here, where the artist is not really constrained by any of those original rules of perspective, he's kind of blown that apart. He's still using it. Obviously, the light, the eye is drawn to the light, and obviously the main figure here in the crucifixion, but using some of the tricks of drawing lines to create the spaces, to create the rooms for different scenes, different parts of events. And we could spend a lot of time discussing what's going on and all the different pieces of the picture and how it fits together with the biblical story and the story that is being conveyed here. What I really want to emphasize is, again, how this religious story is now part of a culture that knows no outside of that. They don't know any different. The Christian story, which is at this point, to be absolutely clear, and we'll kind of cover this later perhaps, this is very much the Catholic story. But again, there was sort of, even at this stage, although by this point there was a little bit of a difference, but certainly in the previous picture there was no alternative. It was the Catholic Church. By this point there is a sort of a difference. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Let's not get bogged down in the Reformation right now. The church is using artworks like this to convey a story, and it's a story of power. And although it is a sort of a philosophical story, and it has the weight of classical myth, but of course the church is telling it as basically a real story, it comes with a huge amount of power behind it. Both that kind of divine, spiritual, what we'll call later numinous power, and also a very real political and social power that the church represents. So they're using art. They're using these art objects in a very direct, very specific way, very powerfully, to create very amazing pictures. I mean, we cannot dismiss this. This is a fantastic painting. But what we're looking at is this electrical charge. And when the subject Again, remember, this is no longer just the individual, but when a society, when that political, social level is engaging with an object like this through the individual, of course, it's always about the individual looking as well, there's a power charge that is coming from behind the picture that rides on the story of the power of the divinity of God and of Jesus and the whole story in the Bible, but also is this very specific political power that the church in Rome is exuding and trying to convey through a picture like this. Even in much quieter pictures, from just a bit later on, again, this remarkable picture telling, again, a biblical story in a very direct, now much more down to earth, much quieter way, but it's still using those techniques of linear perspective, of picture composition, to make the picture accessible and give the picture its power and convey the power of the church. Now, just if you, I don't know, for anyone who's jonesing for some serious art history, like, you know, the sort of thing that I'm a bit dismissive of, we can compare this 1606 version of the Supper of the Mouse by Caravaggio with the other one, the much more famous version. I don't know, you may have seen this. This one is reproduced all over the place. This is the very famous one. This one is in a smaller collection in Milan. This is in the National Gallery in London. Caravaggio painted this one much earlier. And I would, you know, in the old days, I would love to spend a whole lot of time discussing the formal differences going on here. I feel like just by looking at them and comparing them, you can tell the difference of what's going on in this storyline here. This earlier one, when Caravaggio was a bit more free, he was famous, and he was doing well. He was always kind of just breaking even. He was a bit of a wild dude, and always getting in fights and getting in trouble, getting kicked out of towns and chased out. And he was full of life here. So this is very dramatic. The story of Jesus surprises everyone. He's sort of been in, not quite in hiding, but he's sort of been incognito, and he reveals himself to his disciples. Anyway, there's a lot going on here. Look at how this basket is just about to tip off the table here. There's a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, a lot going on in this picture. There's basically a still life painting right here. You could cut this out, and that's a traditional still life painting right now. So Caravaggio, the artist, is showing off. He's showing how good he is at painting. A lot of light, a lot of shadow. Here, he was in hiding. This was coming towards the end of his life. He was in trouble. He was in hiding. It's basically a copy. He probably painted it from memory. Much more muted. All of that energy and excitement has gone. It's much more toned down. But I think maybe you can see why I prefer this one to this one. I mean, this is still a great painting. But everything is much more muted. Notice how the highlights, what's called chiaroscuro, we'll maybe put that word up later. Don't worry about it. It's a cocktail party word that's useful and good to know if you want to do serious art history, but it's not one you necessarily need to know. We'll come back to vocab later. This using light and shade to create an emotional experience is called chiaroscuro, Italian word. And here you're getting the drama of the specific subject matter rather than the kind of the emotional drama. It's much more folded inward. Maybe Winckelmann would have liked this one too better. Anyway, we can look at these paintings. They're interesting. If you're interested in doing serious art history, you can kind of look at those, and I can even, if you want, I can send you articles about this. But more generally, back to the theme of a lecture, the fact that we can compare these, the fact that there is something worth talking about, that people have spilled a whole lot of ink about what's going on in these two different pictures, why are they so different, is because from the beginning of the Renaissance onwards, artists were putting out, and I'm just showing you a couple, there's thousands of paintings that tell the Christian story, tell it to people who had very limited access to anything beyond the life that was right in front of them, which was basically survival. And they would occasionally get to see pictures like this, especially when they were put for churches. A lot of these were obviously done for private wealthy clients, but when pictures like this, like some that I've shown you already, were visible to them or available to them, they would tell a story. And to go back to the idea of the gaze, the relationship between the viewer subject as a society and the object that is the painting, but more importantly the object that's behind the painting, which is the Christian story that the church is telling, the Christian church is telling, it has a profound impact on the development of European society, which then has a profound impact on the global society that we live in today. The way that the church used painting is sort of only one strand, and that's not even what I necessarily want to emphasize here, although that is obviously the core of our story in this art history class. But the bigger picture is how the church moved into people's lives. From the 10th century onwards, basically, in Europe, the church was present in people's lives in a way that was total. It was complete presence. It was everything they did, everything that they operated on, every decision they made, from the moment they first started thinking about things in their youngest childhood all the way to their death. The church was present, and the church knew this and began to use it. Absolutely, we can argue that the church did things that were intended to be positive, that were meant to help people deal with some of those big philosophical issues of life and death, and where did the universe come from, and how am I supposed to behave? And then the political side of that. How do you get a society to behave itself? How do you stop people killing each other whenever they like? And how do you stop people stealing stuff, which makes things inconvenient? All of that stuff. Well, it's very useful to have a moral code that comes from a centralized place that everyone believes in, i.e. God. So there are some kind of practical, political, bureaucratic reasons for the church to have power. But as we're going to explore in the next few sections of the lecture here, obviously there was a lot of negativity that came along with that. And our job here is to expose it and to understand what we're looking at when we talk about the power of the church.